All right, so to finish up Descartes, um, so we're left with mind and world, with all of his Descartes' doubting, and left with the idea that all I know is that I'm a mind. That means I don't know if the world exists for sure, or any other people, by the way. That's part of the world. Where do we go from here? Well, one thing I want to be clear about is Descartes is not a skeptic, contrary to a lot of opinions people have about him. He does not want to leave it there. He definitely wants to build knowledge up from this point and recapture the world. How does he do that? All right. So first thing I want to say about this is that Descartes is a rationalist. This is a whole movement of philosophy in this time period. It's generally opposed to the empiricists, which is Locke, for instance, who we're going to learn next. But as a rationalist, Descartes thinks that pretty much what I have here in my notes, the intellect is more important than the imagination. That is to say, reason is more important than your senses. Okay, reason is more important than your senses. And he has a famous example of a piece of wax. So he's sitting by the fire and he picks up a piece of wax and he starts examining the piece of wax with his senses. He goes through all of them. He's like tapping on it. There's a little sound. It's hard. There's no smell. It has a certain shape, all these things. But, he's holding it up. He's sitting by a fire and he's holding a piece of wax. And of course, it starts to warm up. The shape changes. All of a sudden, it has a little scent to it. It doesn't make a sound when you tap on it. All of the sensory information that he's getting about the wax is contrary to what he just had before. So he's like, even though this is all of these different properties of the wax that I'm sensing have changed, I still know it's the same piece of wax. It must be my intellect, my reason, that tells me that and not my senses. My senses would tell me it's something different, but I know it's the same piece of wax, and it must be my reason that accounts for that. So reason is more important than imagination. He says a judgment is necessary in perception. It's not simply your senses delivering things to you and you just accept them. You have to make a judgment, a reasoned judgment. And he also gives the example of automatons. That's robots. That's the old word for robots. And he's like looking out the window and he sees a bunch of people, he sees a bunch of raincoats and umbrellas running around in the rain from his second-story window. And he's like, I know those are people and not robots, but that's my reason, because if they were robots, it would look exactly the same. Again, reason is more important than your senses is his point. So truth is revealed through investigation. Trust the natural light more than the natural impulse. This is a very much scholastic terminology. Natural light just means reason. Natural impulse kind of means instincts. Okay, so trust your reason more than your instincts. And he thinks that the belief in the external world, remember we're in the mind and world space here. Sure, I believe there's an external world out there, but it's simply an instinct to believe that. I actually need to establish that by reason is his next thing. And he also argues that the intellect is more powerful than the imagination. Imagination includes senses. I know that's kind of confusing. He lumps sensation in with imagination. So I mean, if you're imagining something, you're picturing in your mind. If you're seeing something, you're also picturing in your mind. He calls both of those imagination. And his example is a triangle because you could versus a chalagon. So you could picture a triangle, three-sided figure. You cannot picture a Chalagon, which is, what is a 1,000-sided figure? You just can't picture that in your mind, but you can work out the geometric properties of it. Remember, he's a mathematician. And therefore he says that since you can work out the properties of it, but you can't even picture it in your head, your reason must be more powerful than your imagination. All right. So as I said, sensation is a more vivid form of imagination. So he lumps those two together. When he's talking about imagination, he actually doesn't just mean like picturing things in your mind. He means like also your senses, like what you're seeing, hearing, tasting, all those things. He lumps all that in with imagination. All right, so how does he bridge the gap between mind and world? Well, he starts with what he calls innate ideas. So these are because he can't trust his senses, so all he has is his mind and his ideas. So he's got to start with his ideas. Well, he thinks that there are some ideas that are innate. Innate meaning, well, what does innate mean? It means you're born with it. It's like if you have innate talent, you were born having the talent, right? He means innate, like built in, kind of. And he thinks there are certain ideas that are innate. One of them is cogito ergo sum, interestingly enough. Another one is God. He also thinks mathematical concepts are innate, and also certain logical concepps, like is it possible for something to be and not be at the same time, as an example he gave. I'm going to skip a little bit here. Okay, so how he achieves certainty about the external world. Now, he does this by invoking God. Yeah, I know. It's not what you would expect, but it does serve certain purposes. I mean, for one thing, I mean, if you look at what happened to Galileo, for instance, in this time period, where he was accused of being irreligious, Descartes invoking God here kind of counters that whole narrative, since Descartes in the same camp with Galileo and these other guys. Invoking God here means that he's kind of saying that religion and science do not have to be at odds with one another. I guess that's one thing I would say about that. I'm not sure if that's exactly his thought process in this case, but he does want to go and invoke God here this is how he's going to bridge the gap between mind and world. So how do I know the world's the way it is? It turns out it's God. Okay. So if he can prove God exists, and he can prove that God is a good God, then a good God would not let you have an evil deceiver deceiving you, an evil demon deceiving you. And a good God would give you all the tools you need to make sure the world is the way it is. This is his plan. All right. So can he prove that God exists and is a good God? I'm absolutely going to skip this. You can read it and evaluate it on your own. I do want to say that the arguments he makes for God's existence are not original at all. He's stealing these from other people. Totally Saint Anselm and other people. He's stealing the arguments for the existence of God from others. But bottom line is, he thinks that he has proved God exists. He gives 2 or 3 arguments for that, depending on how you're counting. And then once it's established that God exists, God's good, God wouldn't let you be deceived by an evil demon. The world is the way you think it is. Everything's good. Everything's fine. Everything's solved. Now, I want to say that even when Descartes wrote this, there were a lot of criticisms of these arguments, since they weren't originally his. People they've been out for a while. people had already poked a lot of holes in these arguments, and not a lot. You know, there was a lot of people that bought it, but there was also a lot of philosophers and others that thought that was a no. No, you did not prove God exists. And that's pretty, which is kind of a, that leaves you in a mess, because that, if he doesn't prove God exists, then you're left in your own mind all by yourself with no world, following Descartes' argument here. And that is the case for a lot of people who then, by the way, I should note, thought, well, that didn't work. Let's try to find other ways to connect the mind and the world. So it's really important to understand that Descartes set up this whole premise, this whole like way of looking at things, where somehow I got to reach out with my mind to grasp the world. And a lot of, you know, most people thought he failed at this. And then they're like, well, but how else can we do it? But he set the problem up. You know, there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, he set the whole premise of the situation up, and now other people are going to come and try to solve that, but they're totally accepting everything up to that mind and world point where they're going to be like, okay, we got here, and then Descartes screwed up, and now I'm going to try to do something different. Even to this very day, people are doing this, okay? So just note, I mean, there is a lot to be said for that. I mean, if Descartes didn't prove God exists, and he didn't, all right, so he failed on that, but he did set the problem up that everybody's been obsessing about ever since then. Okay, let's see, what else do I want to, I do want to talk about another thing that Descartes is absolutely famous for, and is the separation between mind and brain, in this case. Mind and brain, because your brain is part of the world, is part of the physical reality, and he is, you know, when I think therefore I am, and you're trapped in your mind, there's no brain. Your mind is not your brain, and your brain is not your mind, and this is Descartes' position. Again, even right now, if you call someone a Cartesian in this respect, in this mind-brain debate, you call someone a Cartesian, you mean that that's someone who thinks that the mind is not the brain and the brain is not the mind. Now, of course, there are tons of people that think your brain is your mind and your mind is your brain. I mean, so there's definitely people that have the opposite view here. But Descartes is the guy who thinks that the mind is not the same as your brain, well, your body, he says, but your brain. In fact, he actually thinks that, you know, the mind is attached to the brain, and he actually, through your pineal gland. Anyway, he thinks the mind is connected to your brain, but it's not the same thing. Your mind is one thing, your brain is another thing. And he gives some arguments. He says they're separate because the body's material, the mind is not material, it's immaterial. He thinks the mind is better known, that it's unextended, which is really, this is kind of a very interesting argument. When he says unextended, that means your mind does not take up any space. That's a trippy thought, by the way. It's like, where is your mind? What is it, right behind your eyes? It is kind of a weird idea to have your mind taking up space. Descartes says it does not take up space, therefore it is not material, it's not physical. Your mind is something completely different from your brain. He also argues that if they can be considered separately, they could be separate, and God could separate them. Yeah, make of that what you will. It doesn't sound that convincing. He thinks the mind is indivisible and the body, but the body is. This has to do with it being extended. If anything bodily, anything material, you can divide in half, but your mind can't be because it's not taking up any space. All right, so I'll take that for what it's worth in Descartes, but do note that the whole idea that the mind is separate from the brain and the body is Descartes, and people that have that view are Cartesians, and but also note that a lot of people, I should note also that a lot of people objected even to that too. I mean, even at his time, people were saying, no, the mind is the brain and the brain is the mind. Not everybody agreed with Descartes when he was even writing this, let alone today. Now there's of course, there's tons and tons of research. It has not been resolved, in case you're wondering. Haven't they set up some kind of experiment to prove that the mind is the same thing as the brain? Not really. I mean, what experiment would prove that? You could prove that the mind is affected by the brain and the brain is affected by the mind or something like that. Well, Descartes would not deny that. But how do you prove that they are the same thing? That is not empirically provable, at least as far as I know right now. All right. Okay, one last point that relates to this, but it actually is a separate point, because he does separate the mental and material into two different kinds of substance. This is called dualism. By the way, that's also called dualism, mind-body dualism, or mind-brain dualism. But he separates substance into material and mental. And he says of the material is substances that they have quantity, which basically means they're measurable. Figure, they have a shape. That means they have a shape. They have a position because they're in space, and they move, motion. Whereas mental substances do not have these things. They're not material. They're not quantifiable. They don't have figure, position, and motion. This is actually now, this one is pretty well accepted now, but it was pretty remarkable at its time because it very much countered the Aristotelian view of the world, the scholastic view of the world of his time, because it meant that material or physical things were kind of mechanical. I swear to God, Aristotle said a rock wants to go down, wants to go down. Descartes never took this point of view. He's like, it's a the physical world is governed by mechanical forces. Rocks don't want things. Right? Material things don't want things. The world, the material physical world is mechanical, which means it's discoverable, quantifiable, measurable. This is a big deal. I mean, he's not alone in this point of view. Again, this is not necessarily original to Descartes. But he was part of the first people that were putting forth this type of view, and one of the more influential ones. And it's really important because, I mean, I don't think science would have happened if you thought that rocks want to go down. I mean, he's part of this movement towards a mechanical view of the world where you can study physical phenomenon, quantify it, measure it, be scientific about it. All right. That was the last major point I wanted to make. He says harmful and beneficial is taught by nature, but through instinct in particular, but not truth. He says size, color, and heat, for instance, are not really in the bodies, but only in our perception of them. That's a little radical position of his. I mean, again, kind of scientific. Color is not in the thing. It's the way we perceive it, which of course is true. I mean, color is a wavelength of energy, light. Red is how we perceive red, but it's just a wavelength of energy, according to science. Heat too. I mean, heat's just the excitement of the molecules. It's not the burning sensation you get in your hand. And he agreed with this. All right. And so, to reiterate, he's not a skeptic, because at the end he says, with the general reliability of the senses and the fact that we can use multiple senses to perceive things, and with our memory and with our intellect, we can judge truly about the world. He's not a skeptic. He thinks he's recaptured the world from his doubt, right? From his method of doubt. Of course, that depends on whether you believe he proved that God exists and is helping us out with this. He clearly does, by the way, he clearly does. So, all right, so there's Mr. Descartes.